Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz. And I'm privileged and honored, to be in the presence of such great scholars. Really, thanks to all of you, and thanks to Center for Study of Islam and Democracy for really organizing this. Now, Dr. Fadl, whose works have enlightened, I think, most of us, including myself for sure, just made a very important point and several important points. But one is the distinction between the divine core of Islam, as we all Muslims believe, which is certainly in the Quran and the undisputed, clear example of the Prophet, and the medieval Muslim mindset that built our Islamic tradition. And by saying when there's a medieval Muslim mindset, the medieval jurisprudential mindset, we're not condemning it, actually. I mean, I use similar terminology too. We're just putting it in a context. When you look at all these blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, which we will discuss today, you see that, yes, Muslim jurists discuss that blasphemy is a capital offense. Just look at the Byzantine Empire just next to them at the same time. They had the exact same laws. Look at the Sassanid laws. They had very similar things. I mean, in that world, your allegiance to the state and your religion was basically the same thing. And states all had this, imperial states had these laws. So Muslims acquired those laws and they didn't think there's a problem with those. Just like they acquired slavery, adopted slavery, although you could have abolished slavery by taking the Quran's calling for freeing a neck as a more definitive value, although it didn't happen. So today we live in a different world, and it is important to distinguish the religious from the historical. It's important to distinguish what's the core of the faith from its historical interpretations. And I think this is quite clear on this burning issue of religious coercion. And blasphemy laws are part of that, but there's a broader problem of religious coercion. That includes religion police forces, that are imposing hijab on women in Iran, right? For example, as we are speaking right now, there are mass protests in Iran, justified protests against so-called morality police, under whose authority just a young woman lost her life, unfortunately. And people are reacting to this idea that the hijab should be imposed by the state instead of Muslim women wearing it by their own choice, which is of course a very respectable and rightful practice. And you see, of course, in Iran that is imposed, and in France, there's the other imposition, which are both wrong, by the way, I should say. Now, on this issue of coercion, one more thing. Dr. Fadl, of course, reminded the key Quranic verse when it comes to these issues, La ikraha fi din, at the beginning of Baqarah 256, there is no compulsion in religion. Now, if I've been calling for taking that verse seriously and in its full implications, right? But that is precisely why some translations of the Quran today that you can find in Saudi Arabia or Malaysia that I myself encountered with, they put a parenthesis in that verse. So instead of there is no compulsion in religion, it reads, there is no compulsion in entering the religion, right? Why do they add that little, make that little operation? Because in their understanding, there's no compulsion only means not forcing the Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, to Islam. That was accepted. That was, by the way, a great thing for 1,000 years. I mean, Christians didn't do that like in medieval times. We did that, so we should be proud of that. But once you enter, things change, right? You cannot leave because they believe there are apostasy laws, although it has no basis in the Quran. And they believe that there are Hisba forces, religious police forces that can monitor your piety and punish you for not praying or fasting, again, which has no basis in the Quran, but which has some certainly presence in our fiqh, and some people are still trying to uphold those. Now, I believe we are at a phase in the Islamic civilization that this coercive understanding of Islam, religion should be coerced by authorities, by community on the individual, by the state on the individual, has brought us to a crisis at a time when people want freedom to be able to choose their beliefs and practices. And also it is incredibly counterproductive too, as we see in Iran, which has become one of the most secular Muslim majority societies, the number one country that produces ex-Muslims. I always say people, becoming atheists or converting to Christianity, precisely because they are fed up with the regime that oppresses them in the name of Islam. So this is a major issue, and blasphemy is, of course, a part of this. And I myself have written on this issue in my book, Reopening Muslim Minds, and elsewhere. So just like to highlight a few points there. Just like on the matter of apostasy, there is no basis for banning blasphemy in the Quran. The Quran never says go and punish the blasphemers. There's no verse that can justify that. Also, interestingly, the Quran sometimes quotes blasphemies against Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and responds to them. Now, that's very interesting. For example, you can read in the Quran that our Prophet was blamed to be a sorcerer, a madman, someone who's lying and creating these things out of himself or learning from somebody. This is interesting because I've noticed that in Pakistan, they have this conception that if you quote a blasphemous word, that becomes blasphemy too, and that should be punished as well. So people are afraid to quote what somebody who supposedly blasphemed said. Well, with that logic, you would actually think that the Quran is blasphemous too, because it's quoting these words that other people said about Prophet Muhammad. So, I mean, those verses show that our Prophet and the first Muslims lived in an environment that they saw and faced these blasphemous words, disrespectful words, mockery, satire, all these things. How did they respond to those things? Now, one thing, no Muslim appreciates these things, right? I mean, we should be clear about that. We're not praising any disrespectful speech to Islam in the world. Quite the contrary, in a civilized world, everybody should respect each other's religious tradition. That is a medium I would prefer. I think most Muslims would prefer. But what if people say things that are not respectful to our religious tradition, our Prophet, our God, or the Quran? Now, the Quran itself guides us on this. I mean, in Ali Imran 186, there's a verse which says to first Muslims, you are sure to hear much that is hurtful from those who were given the scripture before you and from the polytheists. If you are steadfast and mindful of God, that is the best course. So you will hear, no matter what happens, you will hear hurtful words from people of other faiths, polytheists or other monotheistic traditions. And what you should do about it, it says be steadfast and mindful of God. Now, what does this mean? You can look in the tafsir of Fahrettin al-Razi, one of the towering scholars in our Sunni tradition, one of the greatest exegetes of the Quran. He comments on this verse and he says, there are a few people who think that this verse is abrogated by verses that call for war against the polytheists mainly, but the unbelievers in a certain context. But he says that's not a strong opinion. The right opinion is that the verse is not abrogated. I mean, the abrogation itself is a big problem we can speak about. I mean, the whole theory of abrogation. But he says this verse is valid, and then he says, this is because God wanted Muslims to show the beauties of Islam to non-Muslims and win them. He quotes other verses. He quotes the verse where Moses is told to go to the Pharaoh and speak to him gently. And Pharaoh is the evil incarnate in the Quran, right? I mean, that's the ultimate enemy. But Moses was ordered to speak gently. Then he quotes another verse which says, that is 45:14. Tell the believers to forgive those who do not fear God's days. So Fahrettin Razi thinks that this approach of responding gently to offensive talk is valid, and that's the Quranic position. Now, we see this clearly in another Quranic verse, actually, which clearly guides Muslims what to do when people mock your religion. And that is Nisa 140, which actually confirms another verse in Surah An'am. It says, if you hear people denying and ridiculing God's revelation, now this is perfect blasphemy, right? People are sitting there denying God's revelation, making mockery of it. The verse says, do not sit with them unless they start to talk of other things, or else you yourselves will become like them. In my understanding, the verse calls for a boycott, right? Rejection of people who are disrespectful to your faith. So there are disrespectful people to our faith in the modern world today. We should not listen to their maybe speeches. We should not buy their books, publications. But the verse doesn't say go and silence them, let alone go and kill those people. So it just calls for disengagement with disrespectful people. So there's really no basis in the Quran for blasphemy, and that's very obvious. in the Sunnah, in the example of the Prophet, there are some episodes that have been later taken as the basis of blasphemy laws. And these are the famous issues of these poets that ridicule Prophet Muhammad, and not in the Quran, but we hear in the Sirah biography books and also a few hadiths that some of these poets were executed by early Muslims, and jurists said, yes, this is the basis for killing these people who mock our Prophet. And the most famous one is Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, because he's also mentioned in hadith sources as well. So the story is that he was mocking the Prophet, and Muslims couldn't stand this mockery, and then he was given he was assassinated. But when you look at Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, by the way, was a Jewish poet from the Banu Nadir tribe in Medina. And so it was a tribe that Muslims initially made peace with, but then it turned into conflict. But when you look carefully into these stories, you see that he was not just mocking the Prophet. He was a poet, and poetry at the time meant propaganda, and propaganda for war sometimes. After the Battle of Badr, he went to Mecca, incited the Meccan polytheists to fight against the Muslims. So he was doing what we would call today incitement to violence, more than just mockery. And that's why scholars who looked carefully into the stories, one of them, some traditional scholars, one of them was Hanafi scholar Badr al-Din al-Aini in the 15th century. He said these poets were not killed merely for their insults of the Prophet, but it was rather because they aided the enemy against them and joined with those who fought wars against them and supported them. The same is, I think, can be seen in other stories as well, which I try to explain in my book. Now, that is the most interesting thing. There are, as Professor Abu Fadl said, there are also episodes where people mock the Prophet and the Prophet doesn't do anything against them. He even stops the companions for doing anything against those people. He forgives those people effectively. There are several cases of those. In one of them, he says, should we kill those people? And he says, no, be gentle and calm as Allah likes gentleness in all affairs. This is also in the Hadith and Sirah. So isn't this Sunnah? Well, there's a very interesting answer, which became very influential. Some scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very prominent, of course, in the 14th century, he made the argument that, well, the Prophet had the right to forgive those people who insulted him, but we cannot forgive. So, and this has become a standard opinion, and it is quoted in Islamabad High Court decisions in justifying, that penalty for blasphemy. Now, it's quite interesting because we're supposed to take the Prophet's actions as example in Sunnah, in every way. But when he forgives, no, we cannot do that because we don't want to forgive, right? We want to punish. That we somehow explain that away. I mean, there's a lot to talk about this, but if you look, there are blasphemy laws in fiqh, in classical jurisprudence, yes, as in Sassanid or Byzantine laws. But when you look into the Quran and the Sunnah, the undisputable sources of Islam, I think we can very clearly make the case that we don't need blasphemy laws, as we don't need apostasy laws, and they're not justified. And in the modern world, we're seeing that they're counterproductive. Especially blasphemy laws lead to punishing innocent people, sometimes with mobs who lynch them, sometimes through courts. That happens very often in Pakistan, especially, but elsewhere as well. It sometimes is used to silence other Muslims who are just thinking differently from you by calling them blasphemers or apostates, although they're pious Muslims. So this is a major problem, I think, in the world of Islam. And I think we Muslims don't need these things. They're not helping our religion. They're not right in the first place. So we should fully accept La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion in religion, which means no apostasy laws, no blasphemy laws. Our faith is strong enough, to stand by its own virtue and by the faith of its believers. We don't need force, to coercion to uphold it, either in Muslim majority societies or elsewhere.